So one great way to extend the season, that's also one of the easiest ways, is to use row cover. So you can see a lot of the beds here already have row cover on them, and I'm going to show you how I like to set up row cover to create a little microclimate for my plants so that the inside temperature remains higher than the outside temperature, and really importantly, so that dew doesn't form, ice crystals don't form as readily on the plants, and also wind doesn't blow, so you don't get the wind chill inside this little microclimate that you do outside. And what this does is it allows plants to stay alive and to keep growing even as the outside temperature drops and winds blow and ice forms, and it's less hospitable outside. You make this kind of cozy little home for your plants inside. So the best material to use for row cover is this spun polyester fabric that is made specifically for this purpose. It's sold under brand names like Remay and Agribon, and I'll put in the description below this lesson some links to sources. You can usually buy it by the foot, so you buy a big roll, however long you need, and then you can cut it into pieces. So measuring the length of all of the beds that you want to cover, adding about 3 to 6 feet to that for the ends, and you'll see why, per bed, and then adding that all up and getting a big roll is the most economical way to purchase this, rather than purchase little pieces that are already the size. And it's really easy to cut. It's like a thin fabric. You can just use any old scissors or a knife. It even tears pretty easily once you score it. So it's really easy to cut and really easy to work with. And you want to make sure that you get a piece that's wide enough to go over your hoops. So this lettuce bed that I'm going to demo on, the hoops are relatively low. Over in the other garden where I have my kale and cabbage and broccoli and bigger plants, I made hoops that are much higher. So I like to get fabric that is 6 to 7 feet wide, and that's kind of standard, but just check in with the source where you're buying it to make sure that it's going to be wide enough for your bed. So you want to factor in both the height and also the width of the beds, and make sure that you have a piece that's wide enough and it doesn't just barely touch down, but there's a little extra on each side, so you can really tighten it up and air doesn't get up underneath it. And you'll see what I mean once I set it up. So there are lots of different thicknesses of this fabric that you can buy. And one reason for that is this is also a great way to deter pests in the warmer weather. So sometimes you can use a really thin version, a thin thickness of this fabric to cover plants when they're growing in the warm time, and that doesn't allow pests to land on them and lay eggs and eat them. So deciding what thickness you want is based on your conditions, also based on what's available to you, but generally speaking, thinner fabric doesn't keep it as warm. Just as you can imagine, a thinner blanket, like just sleeping under a sheet, isn't going to keep you as warm as sleeping under a big down comforter. So that's one of the factors in the thicknesses. Another thing to keep in mind is that thinner fabric lets in more light. So the thickest of fabrics, they're all developed, this particular fabric is developed to let in the maximum amount of light, trap the maximum amount of heat, and also let in water without like pooling up. So if you were to throw just like a bed sheet over one of these beds, that would still keep them warmer, that would still be beneficial, but not very much light would get in and water would pool up and then drip down in big drips. And the way that this fabric is designed is to let water in, let the rain in, let the sun in, and keep the warmth in, not let the warmth out. So the thicker the fabric, the less light that it lets in, but also the more heat that it traps. So if you're in a situation where it just gets really cold and it stays really cold all winter, then the thickest fabric you can get is going to be your best bet. If you're in a situation where it really fluctuates a lot and there are actually some hot sunny days, then you might either want to choose a slightly thinner fabric or be sure to vent on days when it's really sunny, because heat can really get trapped in there, and that can cause damage to plants or just confuse the plants. You know, if it's winter and they're kind of setting up their physiology to withstand the cold, and then all of a sudden inside the little tent the temperatures go way up above 70 for a day or two, sunny day or two, that can really confuse them, and their internal mechanisms for withstanding cold can get thrown off by that. So I'm going to put, again in the description, kind of a list of the different thicknesses and when you might want to choose each one. If all else fails, just use what you can get. So one way that you can get this if you're on a limited budget is to talk with farms in the area, commercial farms, and they'll often have shorter pieces that they can't use on their long beds because they've had ripped or gotten holes in them, and they're just going to throw them out. And they're still perfectly good for several years. It's UV stabilized material, so that could be a way for you to get some of this fabric without even spending any money and intersecting a waste stream, which is always a great thing to do. Otherwise, ordering them, if you get together with a group and buy a big roll rather than a small roll, you may be able to save that way. So those are some approaches to buying this row cover fabric. Now, the other aspect of setting up a row cover are the hoops. And you can see I've got my wire hoops here, and I'm going to show you how to make these. These are this is what I've come to after many years of experimenting with lots of different setups. This is what I've come to that works really, really well. And it's inspired by a technique that was described in a book called 4-Season Harvest by Elliot Coleman, and I'll put that in the description as well. And it's just very, very simple. Why I like this is because I can make these hoops myself out of galvanized fence tensioning wire, which I got at Lowe's. You can get it at any kind of home improvement store, so it's very accessible even if you don't have a garden store nearby. And you can get a big roll, and it ends up being pretty cheap per hoop when you cut it yourself. You can cut each hoop to the size that you want. So for my lettuce bed, like I said, I'm going to have lower hoops, and that way it's going to catch less wind and just be kind of create a cozy little place for the lettuce without a ton of airspace above them. And for my kale, which grows a lot taller, I'm going to have taller hoops. So I can kind of customize the shape and size of the hoops. And also the key factor that I will show you in just a minute is I put these little loops on the end of them so that I can tie string and I can cinch down the whole row cover with a zigzag or caterpillar style string instead of trying to weight down the sides of them. So I'm going to talk about that a little more in a second, but just to mention some other hoop materials. I've used split bamboo in the past, which is free if you have access to a bamboo patch and can work really well. It tends not to work for more than one season, so I have to split and make new hoops each season, and it doesn't have the hooks, although I guess you could carve a hook, carve a little notch into the side, but it would be a little labor intensive. But split bamboo works pretty well. There are also fiberglass hoops that you can buy from any of the farm supply stores that are going to be selling this row cover fabric. And those are great. I know Natalie likes using those. Those are great. They're really durable and reusable. The reason I don't personally choose to use them is because they're a little bit pricey and I can't customize the size and do these little hoops. So I have quite a bit of space. So it would be just a lot of money to buy those hoops, and then I can't use this zigzag cinching down string to hold the fabric in place. Those are the options that I've used. I mean, I imagine you could just repurpose some other kind of wire, but it needs to be fairly thick. You'll see once I show you how to put the loop in the end of this wire that it needs to be fairly thick wire. So the other step, the other part of this system is holding the fabric down. Now, this is basically a big giant bed sheet kind of material laying on the ground, and as winds kick up and as storms come, it really will want to blow around. And I've had so many disappointing experiences where I don't have it tied down tight enough or weighted down tight enough, and then just as a storm is coming in, which is often when temperatures are dropping, is when it gets blown off my beds. I may not even notice. It might happen in the night, and then I come out the next day and my plants are toast. They're frosted because I wasn't able to keep the fabric on and tightly cinched down. So some ways that you can tighten to weight them down or to use rocks or sticks or something else heavy, and you want to make sure that you put them very closely with each other. So I don't have an example of that here, but you want to make sure that you don't leave a lot of space for air to come in underneath and pull it up. You also want to make sure each end is tied down tight. So I like to just weight them down with rocks. Some people will leave a long extra part of the fabric and tie it around a stake in the ground, literally tie a knot, and that holds it down really well. And then, as I said, this cinching string caterpillar method is really what I think of as the best. It will really hold on even in the wind. So now I'm going to show you how I like to bend the little loops into my hoops. Loopy hoops is what we're going for, so that I can tie the string and hold the fabric down really well. Here we go. So you want to make a hoop. You want to take a piece of wire that's about 2.5 to 3 feet longer than your ultimate desired hoop, because a certain part, so this one's already been bent, a certain part below the loop that you put in the hoop is going to be sunk down into the ground to anchor it, and then you need some to to turn this curve into the loop. So measure what you need for your bed, and then you want to start bending the loop at about a foot from the end. So you have about a foot of wire to sink down into the ground. You can't just do this with your bare hands. It can be helpful to have a pair of pliers. And what you want to do is bend out. So not in to complete the circle of the hoop, but out the opposite direction that the curve of the wire is going. So I'm actually, because it's cold, I'm not going to use pliers. I'm just going to use my hands. And that's the nice thing about this wire. It's sturdy enough to hold up, but you can bend it with your hands. So I'm just going to bend out like this. Hope you can see what I'm doing, even though I've got my gloved hands. And then come in. Whoop. Can be helpful to stand on the other side. Come in and around. So just a simple twist in the wire. And then what that creates is this loop that you can either put string directly through if you have a shorter bed. That's a more secure method. Or you can just loop the string underneath. And I'll show you how I do that setting up this lettuce bed. But that's the simple setup for creating these hoops. And like I said, if you buy a big roll of this wire, one of these hoops ends up being about $1. So now, this was just a demo one. Now what I'm going to do is stick, I've already done some of these, but I'm going to stick my hoops in the ground. So it's pretty easy to do. Just stick it so that the loop is sitting right on the soil surface. And if you have rocky soil like me, you might have to try a few times before you really get it all the way in there. And you want to make sure, I like to leave between 2 and 3 feet of space in between the hoops. You want to make sure that that's consistent. And because these hoops are so affordable and accessible, it's easy to have, enough of them. So spreading them out really wide just means that there's more opportunity for air to get underneath and pull the fabric up so that it's less tightly held down. So closer is better, but too close is awkward. So closer than it wants to be about 2.5 to 3 feet is really ideal. So then I've set these up at about 2.5 to 3 feet apart. And now I'm going to take my row cover. This one unfortunately has a couple of holes, but it still does the job. And I'm gonna pull it over. So I've pulled this fabric over. Ideally you want fabric without holes, but this is what I've got. So I'm working with what I got. And what I did is I put a rock on the other end of the fabric with a little bit left over. And now I'm gonna pull this side so that it's nice and taut. And making sure that the fabric is taut will really help the whole system work. So nice and taut, and then I just get a big rock. And like I said, another way to do this is to have a little bit of extra and pound a stake into the ground, literally tie it around the stake. So that's a nice way too. Now for my favorite part. This is the string. So each of these hoops has the little loop on the bottom. We've got our loopy hoops. And what I'm going to do, I have some string here. And what I'm going to do is tie the end of this string to the first loop here. Just whatever kind of knot you're comfortable with. And then here comes the caterpillar or zigzag. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and forth, and I'm going to loop. I'm just going to pull tight on this string, and as I come to each hoop, I'm going to loop the string under so that then I can pull tight over again. So I'm going to hop back and forth. If you have high hoops or a very long row, it's really helpful to have a buddy. So each person is on either side, and you can just hand the string back and forth. Now the ultimate final step, once you've set this up, is getting underneath to harvest whatever it is you've got in there. And this is another reason why I really like this system with the zigzag or caterpillar string, because you don't have to pick up a bunch of rocks or pieces of wood that are weighting down the fabric, which may have frozen to the fabric if it's moist and cold. You can just simply lift up one side, and you can even push it up and it'll hold up, reach underneath and gather, in this case lettuce, gather whatever you are harvesting, and then cinch it back. You don't have to take apart the whole hoop just to reach in and harvest. It's a really wonderful way to keep it nice and tight and also be able to access to harvest. Now, the final thing I want to say about row cover and this system is that if you have raised beds, one way to do it is to, if you already have the fiberglass hoops, or if you just want to make bamboo hoops, is to put little eye screws or little hooks, or even just screws into the outside of the wood of the raised bed, right where your hoops are coming down. And that's actually what Natalie's done in her garden. And you basically do the same system, but the loop is not on the hoop. It's just something that's sticking out of the wood of the raised bed. So with that, you can just have a little more versatility with what your hoops are made of, like using something like bamboo. And then the whole thing is easier to access, because if this was right at the edge of a raised bed, you would be squeezing your fingers in between the wood of the raised bed and the hoop to find that little loop. Whereas if you put a screw or a hook on the outside of the wood, you can just easily go back and forth and hook it on. So that's kind of an adaptation if you happen to be working with raised beds. So I wish you well in your fall and winter gardening. It's so rewarding to go out into the garden in November, December, January and peek under here, and it's almost like you find a treasure, because the plants under there are still green and alive and crisp and delicious and ready for you to eat, even though the world outside of their little cozy home is looking a little dreary, and maybe you've been eating a lot of porridge and stew, and it's just so nice to have this really simple technology for having access to fresh food even in the cold weather.